Hello, Connecticut. It's wonderful to be back with you. As you know, I left March 1 and now I'm in Nebraska and things are wonderful here, but it was such a delight to hear from you and that you wanted me to say a few words at this event that you're having about preschool expulsion, but actually an event about how to prevent preschool expulsion. As you know, it's a topic that's been very close to the work that I've been doing since the time that I was in Connecticut, and really pretty much for the past 20 years. It's important, I think, for us to remember that Connecticut is the very beginnings of real serious anti-preschool expulsion efforts in the United States. And I say that because, as you know, we have one of the nation's first statewide mental health consultation programs that's designed specifically to prevent preschool expulsion and suspension. That's the Early Childhood Consultation Partnership Program. That's one of the first in the nation to exist, and it's right there in Connecticut. It's also the first to have ever been rigorously evaluated in a statewide random controlled trial, right there in Connecticut. And it's the first to be federally recognized by the federal government as an evidence-based prevention program for preschool expulsion preventions as a statewide effort. That's all right there in Connecticut. And also in 2015, Connecticut became the very first state in the nation to ban preschool expulsion and suspension. And so there's a lot to be proud of in Connecticut, but we also know that chances are very good that the work is not done yet, and that there's still a lot that we need to do, especially coming out of the pandemic, to make sure that all of our children are given the opportunity they need in order to be able to succeed in school, and that means not having them kicked out of preschool programs. We started the work on preschool expulsion and suspension with a report that came out back in 2005, and that was when I was there at Yale, and we issued it right there in Connecticut. And that report was the first national study of the rate at which children are expelled from preschool programs. And Connecticut was ranking pretty high in terms of the rate at which children were being kicked out of, expelled from, told not to come back to early care and education programs. In fact, nationwide, children are expelled from preschool programs based on the data we had back in 2005, expelled from preschool programs at a rate more than 3 times that of grades K through 12 combined. And when you're looking at child care programs, the rate's about 13 times that of grades K through 12 combined. That's a lot of really young kids getting kicked out of school before they even get to school, getting kicked out of school when they're in preschool. There were some subsequent data efforts to be able to try and quantify the number of children being expelled every single year from our early care and education programs. And when you add it all up, it's about 100, this is before the pandemic, about 192,000 preschoolers expelled or suspended from early care and education programs. That's a lot of kids. You could fill up, 192,000, you could fill up every single seat at Yankee Stadium, every single seat at Met Stadium, every single seat at Giants Stadium, and you still have 13,000 expelled preschoolers standing in the parking lot without a place to sit. That's how many children we were expelling before the pandemic back in 2019 every single year from our early care and education programs. And when we were looking at who it is that's more likely to be expelled, we found that it's when you have mixed age groups, it's our 4-year-olds more than the 3-year-olds. So the bigger children were more likely to be expelled. We found that our black children were expelled at about twice the rate of white children. Boys expelled at about 4 times the rate of girls. And so when you put it all together, there's really 3 B's of preschool expulsion risk: big, black, and boy. And the more of those that existed within an individual child, the greater the likelihood that that child's challenging behaviors would be met with a decision to expel that child, kick that child out of the program. Now note, I'm not saying that children who are bigger, children who are black, children who are boys are more likely to have challenging behaviors. Not saying that. What I'm saying is that our bigger children, our black children, our boys, really young kids, are more who have these kind of challenging behaviors or anything else that might be causing a stressor for the teacher. It's more likely for them to be kicked out as opposed to something else provided to them. That's what we were finding back in 2005. U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights came in about a decade later and largely confirmed this using data that they were collecting nationwide through the public schools. If you look at like preschool expulsion and you compare it to something, I would say that one thing that you could potentially compare it to is the incarceration rate in the United States. And the reason that I would say that is because When you're talking about preschool expulsion, you're talking about kicking kids out of the society of early education. And when you're talking about adult incarceration, you're talking also about kicking people out of society, and in that case, the adult society, and incarcerating them and putting them away in jails. We know that when you look at the rate at which children are expelled from preschool programs, about 6.5 to 7.5 children per 1,000 enrolled in our preschool programs, that's pretty close to about the 7 per 100,000 that are incarcerated in the United States. 7 per 1,000 that are incarcerated in the United States. Incarceration rate very, very similar to the preschool expulsion rate. When you look at amount of racial disproportionality, you see that our African American children are expelled from preschool programs about 2 to 3 times the rate of white children. When you look at incarceration rates, black individuals incarcerated at about 3 times that of white individuals. When you look at gender disparities, boys expelled at about 3 to 4 times the rate of girls, men incarcerated at about 5 times the rate of women. So in other words, I suppose that doesn't necessarily prove that there's a preschool to prison pipeline, but if there is, isn't it incredible how consistent the diameter of the pipe is? The very same children that we choose to expel from preschool programs early on in their life become the very same adults later on that we choose to incarcerate at disproportionate rates. That's why it's important for us to be thinking about this in terms of how do we intervene early to be able to prevent that? There's been quite a few studies that have looked at like elementary school children who have been expelled or suspended from elementary school and what the impact of that is. And we know that children, when they're expelled or suspended early on, they're more likely to form negative attributions and thoughts about school. They're more likely to fail a grade. They're more likely to not do well on school tests. But we also know that they're about 10 times more likely to drop out of school. And we also know that they're about 8 times more likely to be incarcerated when they're an adult. And there's more recent research that's shown that the preschool age children of incarcerated adults are about 3 times more likely themselves to become kicked out of preschool. So in other words, it's intergenerational as a cycle. You have a child who might be expelled from preschool, and that puts that child at an increased likelihood of dropping out of school or being pushed out of school later on, which increases about 8-fold the likelihood of being incarcerated. And then when they have a baby themselves, that baby now is at a 3-fold increased likelihood of repeating that cycle for the next generation. And it goes over and over again until we decide that we want to intervene someplace. And the best place to intervene in a cycle like that is right at the point of preschool expulsion, right when these children are young. But we also know that one of the best predictors of preschool expulsion isn't even child behavior, it's teacher stress. When teachers scored higher on measures of teacher job stress, they expelled at a significantly higher rate. And when teachers screen positive for depression, they expel at twice the rate of teachers who screen negative. So in many ways, it's not even really about the child's behavior. It's about our adult capacity to be able to manage a child's behavior. And when you have a stressed out teacher and you have one child in the classroom, then it becomes easy for that child to be seen as the last straw. And that child then gets kicked out. It's important to remember that preschool expulsion is not a child behavior. It's an adult decision. And it's an adult decision that might be based in part on the behavior of the child, but also in large part on our adult capacity to be able to see what's happening, to feel like we have the ability to be able to manage that and to have active solutions. That's why it's important that Connecticut has programs like the Early Childhood Consultation Program, where you have mental health specialists who can come into the early care and education classrooms and provide support to the teacher so that that teacher can make a decision other than expelling that child from the program. And I can't imagine a time that that's needed more than right now. Teachers have had it rough. Early educators have had it rough during the course of the pandemic. We did a study of early educators across the nation and found that at the beginning of the pandemic, 46% of them were screening positive for depression. I'm not saying 46% of our early educators in the nation were sad every once in a while, or that they every once in a while didn't sleep too well. I'm saying 46% of our nation's early care and education providers we're screening positive for depression on a scale that predicts diagnosable levels of depression. And 18 months into the pandemic, that 46% became 56%. And we already know that when teachers screen positive for depression, they're twice as likely to expel some child from the program, because they're not going to have the capacity to be able to manage those challenging behaviors unless there's somebody who can come in and provide that support for those teachers. Our teachers should not be lone rangers. We should be providing them the supports that they need in order to be able to do the very best that they can. We cannot afford to underpay our early care and education providers, and then when they cry out for supports, not even provide them that either. The other thing that I would add is this. We also know that racial bias can play an awful big role in this. We did a study back in 2015, 2016, where we actually had teachers from across the nation sit down, and they had headphones on, and they had a screen in front of them, and there was a little bar at the bottom of the screen. It was an eye tracker. And the eye tracker could measure down to a pixel on the screen and down to a thousandth of a second exactly where that teacher was looking. And the instructions said, you're going to watch a video of some children playing. And this is a study to see how quickly teachers can find evidence of challenging behaviors. That the secret, this is what we told them, the secret to being able to intervene early and to be able to stop a behavior problem early is to be able to see when it might become a problem, so that you can then be able to do something about it. And so what we want you to do is to watch this video, and anytime you see a child do something that could become a behavior problem, I want you to hit this button. Now that's the thing we told them. The parts we didn't tell them yet was this. None of these children are going to misbehave in these videos. And the reason that we know that is because all four of these children in the video, a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl, all four of these children were child actors that we had hired and placed at a table and asked to play with Play-Doh. And so really we weren't interested in whether they could find behavior problems quickly. What we were interested in was this. When I led them to believe that a child might misbehave, where do their biases take their eyes? And essentially what we found was this. When we led teachers to expect that a child might misbehave, their eyes went directly to African American children, especially the black boy. And then when we later asked them who they thought they were looking at more, they thought they were looking more at boys. But their eyes didn't tell that same story. Their eyes told a story that indeed who they were really looking at the most were black children, especially the black boy. In other words, teachers thought they had a boy bias or an anti-boy bias when it comes to behavior problems. But in fact, teachers, both black teachers and white teachers and brown teachers, all teachers overall, when led to believe that a child's going to misbehave, look mostly at black children. And this much I know for a fact. If I'm expecting something like challenging behaviors to be happening over here, and that's where I'm looking, well, that's probably where I'm going to find it. I'm not going to find it over there, because I'm not looking over there. I'm looking over here. And that's why it's important for us to realize that when it comes to children being expelled from preschool programs, it's not primarily about the behavior of the children. It's about our adult behaviors. It's about our expectations, our ability to be able to manage challenging behaviors, and also where we choose, perhaps unconsciously, to expect to find those challenging behaviors. That's the kind of work that we've been working on here in the context of the research that we do. We started that research right there in Connecticut at Yale, but we're continuing it here with the team that we have here in Nebraska. Oh, one other thing too that I should tell you is this. We also found that a startling number of our early care and education providers during the course of the pandemic reported being exposed to racialized aggression themselves. They were the ones targeted by racialized aggression. That during the course of the pandemic, somebody either verbally said something aggressive or physically did something aggressive to them about their race. And one of the things that we found when we looked at the relationship between that and mental health was this. Race did not predict further deterioration of mental health functioning in early care and education providers. Racial identity did not predict teachers becoming more depressed or more stressed out. However, when we combined race with exposure to racialized aggression, that did predict increasing depression rates, increasing job stress rates. In other words, race did not predict increasing mental health problems, but racism did. And our early care and education providers, almost all of them women, and overwhelmingly in some of our communities, women of color, are indeed exposed to racism in their daily lives. And that will impact their mental health too. And if we care about our early educators as human beings, we will take that seriously. And we will find ways to be able to support their mental health and also support them in terms of the trauma in which they receive on a daily basis, oftentimes regarding race. I'm going to end by saying this, that social justice and civil rights are often matters of access. Access can mean access to a seat on a bus. It can mean access to voting. It can mean access to higher education. It can mean access to elementary school. And it can also mean access to our preschool and early care and education programs. But access isn't just about getting in the front door. It's about also making sure you're not shoved out the back door too in the form of preschool expulsion and suspension. And that's why I care deeply about this. There are many of our children who historically, for 450 years, had been denied access to education. And we cannot, in good conscience, create early care and education programs that continue to disenfranchise children from access to education, in this case in the form of access to early education. So I applaud the things that are happening in Connecticut. I'm just thrilled that I was there for a big part of the things that were happening in Connecticut, and I charge you to keep going forward. I'm going to end with a real quick story. Back in maybe 2015, 2016, I was getting ready to stop off at a deli in Bethany. I lived in Bethany at the time, not too far from New Haven. And I was getting ready to fly to Washington to testify for the House Appropriations Committee regarding issues having to do with early care and education. And stopped off at the deli to get a cup of coffee, and I saw a man there named Richard Doolittle. He was probably in his 80s at the time, and he was the town peach tree farmer. He grew peach trees, and when he grew his peach trees, you know, everybody knew that he grew the best peach trees in town, and he was the expert on anything having to do with gardening, and so the whole town referred to him as Dr. Doolittle, because I guess if you're in a small town and you're the expert on something, your last name is Doolittle, everybody's going to call you Dr. Doolittle, I guess. And so I come up to him and I said, Dr. Doolittle, and I didn't tell him where I was going, but I said, I'm curious, if I were to take the life of a peach tree and break it down into 3 phases. The first one is when I put the seed into the ground and then it sprouts. And the second phase is when the sprout turns into a tree. And the third phase is when the tree starts to produce fruit. And I want to have really good peaches. And say, for instance, I could make one of those phases perfect. Perfect rain, perfect sun, perfect everything. For one of those. The other 2, I don't know what I'm going to get, but one of those I can make perfect, and I want to get good peaches. Which phase should I pick to make perfect? And he didn't waste any time at all. He said, well, I'd pick the first one. And I said, well, why? And he said, because whatever you do to that little seed will set the potential for everything that tree can become. And that stuck with me. I actually took it with me when I was going to Congress, because I thought, well, if these appropriators in Congress aren't going to listen to my science, maybe they'll at least listen to the wisdom of a peach tree farmer from Connecticut. You know, and so with that story, I want to thank you for all that you're doing to not only get kids in early care and education programs, but to make sure that they're having good experiences there and that they're not pushed out the back door. And that our early care and education providers can have the supports they need to make the decisions they want to make. I've never met an early care and education provider who went into the field of early care and education because they wanted to kick kids out of school. You know, so thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you do. Bye.